Let's look now at partitioning systems. There are two partitioning systems, and these are done at the time of setup when you first start a new disk. So let's go back to the disk manager. For some reason I closed it earlier, so we need to reopen it. There it is. Right now, these two hard drives here, if I right click on one of these, I don't have this option, but if this were a brand new hard drive I just installed on my system, bought out of the store, I would have an option to initialize this disk. And what that means is to choose what kind of partitioning system I want. Partitioning system has to do with how tracks and partitions are laid out on that disk. There are two of these. The MBR, or Master Boot Record System, is the older one. It was capable of having 4 partitions on the drive. You could actually make more than that, but they were what we call extended partitions, but 4 primary partitions. These were compatible with the old BIOS firmware for booting the computer. Now, the BIOS was a chip that used to be on older systems, you still find it on many today, that had information about what the computer had in it, what kind of drives and so on it had in it, as well as controlled the boot process for that computer. And it was only capable of reading this old MBR type of track and partition information on the disk. Today, most computers have a different type of chip called the UEFI. The UEFI is much larger than the old BIOS was and has a lot more information. It's a lot more configurable by the user, and it uses this new GPT, or GUID partition table system of laying out tracks and partitions. So the GPT can have any number of partitions, actually a very large number. I don't know what the upper limit is, but it can have any number of partitions across this particular disk, or any particular disk that uses the GPT system. And the GPT file, or partition system, I should say, is compatible with that UEFI firmware for booting the computer. I said I was going to talk about the difference between partitions and volumes. So let's talk about that. Let's look over here, and you notice that these are basic drives. When this is a basic drive, these are technically called partitions. If these were dynamic drives, these become volumes. So a volume can span different disks, a partition cannot. So that's kind of a technical usage, and people use the two terms interchangeably, I think wrongly so, but there is a difference between the two terms. Most of us use them just interchangeably, as I did earlier on in the lectures. Let's talk about mapped and mounted volumes. Again, if I look at this, I can see that this has a drive letter. It is mapped to the C drive. These over here are not mapped. They're unmapped. They do not have a drive letter associated with them. Now, I can change this drive letter. I'm going to do it up here on the D drive. I'm not actually going to change it, but I'll show you where that's done. And if I click here, change drive letter and path, you'll notice I can change the drive letter, and I give it any of these drive letters that are available that are not used elsewhere. But you notice that's not the only option I have. And right now this is grayed out because I already have it set up, and I'm not partitioning a new drive, but this would normally be visible if I was doing that. And rather than giving it a drive letter, I can mount it into an NTFS folder. What do I mean by that? And by the way, when I do that, I'm no longer calling it mapping it, I'm calling it mounting it. So this is mapping, give it a drive letter. This is mounting, give it a folder. So let me talk about what I mean by that. I'm going to go ahead and open up a whiteboard here and kind of demonstrate or describe the difference to you a little bit. With a mapped drive, I have, say, is this untouch? Okay, I have a C drive, for example, and C drive has a top-level folder called /. That's the root folder on the C drive. And then inside my C drive, I have things like Windows, users, right? All these top level folders that are in here. Each drive here, let's say I have a D drive, it has its own file system here, right? Like that. And it's got its folders in here. So whatever these folders are called, data, downloads, whatever I call these folders. Each individual drive has its own individual system. Now, with other types of systems, such as, say, Linux file systems, you have a top-level folder. It's called / or the root folder. And then within the root folder, you've got top-level folders. So Etsy, mount, and so on. Oops, MNT. And in this mount folder over here, if I want to add a new drive, what I would do would be to just give it a name. So I would call this, say, Fred. And I've got a Fred drive. And this Fred drive just is part of this master file system. Well, if I mount a folder here, what I'm doing is, and I would browse to where I want to put it, what I'm doing is I'm just adding it to, let me close that again, I'm just adding it to a file system here, and I would browse to wherever I want it, and then I would put it in here, and I would just call it Fred. Or if I wanted to, I could have another one out here, and I would call it, if I want to give it a letter, I could. I'll call it R drive. But it's mounted inside the file system like this, rather than having its own file system like that. And so that's the difference between the two. It's a little hard to wrap your head around, but once you do it, it's kind of fun to do. So that is, let me see, I think we've covered down here, yeah, mounting the drives. We're going to take on next the storage spaces in the next video, so I'll meet you there.